Welcome to HFY Prey, where every star tells a tale. Hey everybody, how's it going? Before we get into today's video, I want to ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, it's free, and it will let you know whenever we post new videos. Without further ado, despite the good times aboard the space exploration light cruiser, Orion's Bow, they were still harrowing and life-threatening far too often for Xavor's liking, and against far too many exotic new threats. From cults to giant monsters to a self-styled emperor of space, the red-scale EEG had seen more horrors than any one person should, and had craved to return home to the EEG conglomerate. The humans had a phrase about this, calling it a wish upon a monkey's paw. It was apparently an outdated term, the meaning consistent, but the origin unknown. The meaning was that a wish would be granted, but in a way that made one regret ever making the wish. His wish to return home was granted via convalescent leave. Multiple broken bones and a significant amount of blood loss had marked Xavier as unfit for duty, and his friends and the crew of Orion's Bow had deemed it safer for him to be sent home until he could improve. Where this monkey's paw factored in was that he wasn't simply allowed to convalesce as a war hero, admired for his bravery, his size, and his deep red scales. No, on top of the fact that he was to return to the Bow upon being cleared for service, Xavier was required to lecture at the military academy the moment he was able to leave the hospital. Over the generations, multiple academies across the various continents on the EEG home planet of Tarvin were consolidated as the three-eyed reptiles made their way into space. Now, the multiple sections across continents were all arms of the Tarvin Military Academy, the magnet school that recruited the best of the best from across the conglomerate space. Xavier had not been invited to attend Tarvin Academy, leading to even more resentment that he was now ordered to lecture at a place that had previously deemed itself too good for him. His injuries were no longer life-threatening, downgraded to extremely inconvenient. The broken bones had been set, and the fragments either extracted or glued into place, so he no longer had to worry about ruptured organs from moving around too much. Of course, this led the military man to grow stir-crazy. This, as a result, saw him signed up to lecture at Tarvin Military Academy. DEG lecture halls were similar in shape to human ones, barring planets with unusual particle contents in the air. The laws of acoustics were essentially universal. The professor was an attractive EEG woman named Yaren, only a little older than Xavier himself. Quite young for EEG academia, since he had joined the military as soon as he was able. Her beige scales were bright and healthy, her conical skull coming to a nice feminine point at the back, and her short body was broad to advertise her fertility, showing off to any potential mate that she could produce a large clutch of eggs. Xavier rolled into the room, seated in a tracked mobility chair since his wounds were still too grievous for extended walking. The students immediately made sounds of quiet awe at the sight of him, and the petty officer inwardly preened. He knew he was an impressive specimen. His scales were deep red, an incredibly rare color amongst his species. His skull came to a broad, shallow point like a gumdrop. He was slimmer than most EEGs, but his sheer height helped make up for that deficiency. He was nearly as tall as the average male human. "So, Xavier," Yaren began, a pleasant gurgle to her voice, "you've been assigned to a role in the human space exploration fleet. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like?" Xavier tipped his head back into the right in his people's equivalent of a self-effacing smirk. EEG mouths did not lend themselves to subtle gestures, and they could only bare their teeth when it was time to bite. In a word, terrifying. His voice was a deep growl. Or maybe horrifying is a better term. Kellen went on a tangent about the difference once. Apparently, terror is the anticipation of something frightening, while horror is when you actually experience it. He paused, realizing he'd gotten ahead of himself. To start from the beginning, I've been assigned to a human light cruiser called Orion's Bow. Apparently, it's named after the weapon of a hunter from human myth. It's what the humans call a HAB ship, that is, a starship that's capable of self-sustainment. The Bow has an elaborate system of hydroponics that allows it to provide food, water, and oxygen for its contingent of crew. We supplement the bland food with normal rations, but if we ran out of supplies, we could theoretically sustain indefinitely. Orion's Bow is under the command of Captain Trent Riley. He's a male, human. Xavier took a moment to look out at the class, so many trios of young, bright eyes staring back at him. You've all seen pics of humans, right? At the gentle murmurs of affirmative, he continued. Riley. Xavier paused again. Human naming conventions are strange. They typically have two names, which they share with relative freedom. The first name is a personal name. The second identifies what family to which the human belongs. On human ships, we typically address humans by their family name. He took a moment to figure out where he'd left off when he'd barely even started. The captain takes what he calls a hands-on approach to leadership. He can often be found conversing in person with those he wants to communicate with, despite the fact that humans have the same means of distance communication as the rest of us. Honestly, they take their communications to another level. Each human has a personal communicator on his or her hip, and I've seen this in humans outside of the bow as well. But Riley prefers to meet in person when possible. So a lot of times, you'll see him wandering the ship. Xavier chuckled, mostly to himself. The first time I saw him moving, I thought I had done something wrong or we were in danger. The captain has a way of stalking through the corridors like he's on his way to attack something, but that's just how he moves. It sounds intimidating. Yaren observed. It can be, Xavier admitted. All humans are imposing in their own way. How they casually ignore extremes of temperature or their ingenuity in combat. But they're also often disarmingly friendly. Humans are earnest in a way that is difficult to express. I've seen the captain employ great duplicity in negotiations. It's not as if they can't lie or don't understand it, but I think the danger of their daily lives must lead them to value honesty and straightforwardness in a way that we might not. The injured EEG took a breath. Riley's executive officer is a man named McBride, and the commander is a harder man than Riley. Not a bad person, but... He paused, trying to think of a good way to phrase it. Perhaps sharper is a fair term. Riley has a natural aggression to him, but one that is not directed at his crew. McBride is stern, always watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty in his crew. There were a few murmurs along the student body. These humans were sounding more and more dangerous. It took me a while to accept Lieutenant Kellen, Xavier continued. She is, in many ways, her commander's opposite. She's soft, gentle, a clutch mother, as you might say. It felt a poor fit to have her aboard a military vessel. However, on my first mission with the bow, she was instrumental in a smooth victory. Kellen is unconventional, and her kindness helps to counterbalance McBride. One of the students near the back piped up. Is it true that humans live in fire? Xavier's left and right eyes dilated in brief confusion. Not as far as I know, but it is true that humans have an incredible durability in different biomes and conditions. They can endure cold that would cause irreparable damage to us, but can also live comfortably in temperatures that we would consider warm. That was a shock to the students. Academically, most knew that humans were resilient and lived on a multitude of planets nowadays. To have it spelled out for them like that was still impressive. That's part of the reason why those who work on human ships have to be carefully vetted, Xavier continued, and why no non-human has yet set foot on Earth. The comfortable temperature for humans aboard the Orion's bow is dangerously close to being too cold for my good health. Then our Drian engineer finds it uncomfortably warm. Yaren glanced over with her leftmost eye. The humans have a Drian on their crew? Human animosity with the cold-weather avians was well known. The Drian Federation had a war machine that had rolled over all individual stellar nations until it had run into a barely space-capable human commonwealth. The two militaries fought to a standstill, and it was a subject of debate whether the humans would have managed to win that exchange had the war continued. Xavier chuckled. I was surprised too when I first heard about it. Makira isn't a Federation native, though. Her parents were refugees and raised her in a necky space. That was basically all the explanation that was needed. The Ford insectoids were strange to the rest of the galaxy, and someone who was raised among them wouldn't behave the same as warmongering Dryans. Professor Yaren, Xavier addressed her again. So, for those who might aspire to work on a human ship, what is the average day like? Xavier spread his arms. Well, honestly, it's not terribly different from most other vessels. It's more unique, living on a hab ship than the fact that the crew are humans. One of the biggest things to note with humans is that they're quick to form cliques. These aren't necessarily exclusionary, but humans love to form or adopt small tribes. Usually, these cliques form out of proximity, such as engineers assembling into one. But that's not a guarantee. Each little group will have its own inside jokes and behavioral conventions, and so you need to learn how to navigate these, keeping to standard human attitudes until you seem to be welcomed to use the clique's terms. Familiarity is generally the best decision. The injured lecturer took a moment to remember where he'd left off before the question sent him on a different tangent. So you asked what life was like, and I said, horrifying. To elaborate, I don't think my experience was normal. At least, I hope it was not. My first mission, which had been intended as a simple shakedown operation, turned into a battle to stop a cult and rescue captives. There were very few operations which went smoothly without some surprise or twist. We fight for our lives, and many people lose theirs. The humans are hardy, but they can't fix everything. A girl in the middle of the crowd, with scales so pale, they were nearly gray, piped up. What was the scariest situation you found yourself in? Zavor took a moment to consider. There are a lot of candidates, and I know how awful that sounds. I've probably been at worst scrapes since, but the sheer panic of being chased by a giant monster stands out to me the most. We crash-landed on a death world in the southeastern fringe. He elaborated, and already saw students wince. The Galactic. Southeast was no man's land, populated almost entirely by pirates, warlords, and madmen. It was unknown if there was a sapient species in that nebula-choked mass of stars, but the discovery of humans at the edge of the fringe and the subsequent revelation that the mammals lived on a world with a molten core and were intimately familiar with the horrors of death worlds that had inflicted generational trauma upon the galaxy had caused many stellar cartographers to reissue their galactic maps with the classic "Here be monsters" line over the vague mass of the galactic southeast. To shorten a long story, I found myself being hunted by a gigantic insectoid monster, easily the size of a small freighter. Zavor mentioned a beast the size of a 2-story home was even more unsettling. It tore open my back, and if it hadn't been for Carver's first aid spray, I'd likely be dead. As it was, I had to lie there while the humans killed the thing. The Marine had helped Zavor to hide out of the massive beetle's reach. Was that what left you so injured? The girl asked, clearly meaning his current state. Zavor gave a quick jerk of his head in the negative. No, that was, months ago now. I think, if not a little longer. Time tends to blur on deployment, especially aboard a ship that doesn't actually need to restock its supplies. One student near the front, a young man with brown scales, politely raised his hand. On the subject of injuries, I've heard rumors about humans living through impossible things. Have you seen anything like that? Zavor tilted his head back in another smirk. You have to be more specific, he quipped, continuing before the boy could refine his question. I've seen humans do insane things and heard tell of far more. One that I witnessed which stands out to me had to do with Captain Riley himself. When we fought that giant monster, it hit him in the leg, and Riley was limping until we got back to the ship, where the medic explained that his knee had been dislocated. The joint had been completely forced out of the socket. He explained to horrified gasps and murmurs. EEGs were sturdy but not flexible at all. The idea of a joint being ripped from its socket meant, to an EEG, a crippling injury and only the slightest of chances to ever heal from it. The medical officer wrenched the captain's knee back into place, and after a night's rest where he didn't strain it, Riley was walking around good as new. Zavor finished the story. The student was stunned. How is that possible? The red EEG tapped his chin to his left shoulder in a shrug. Humans are flexible, more so than Nasab or Dryans. Their tendons and ligaments can stretch to degrees that would be devastating to other species, and they seem built to pop their joints back into place. He clenched his teeth in a grimace, remembering how Lieutenant Danica Kellen's smooth flexibility had allowed her to stand from a stealthy crawl when his more limited range of motion had forced him to walk his hands up a wall to stand up. Without fanfare, when I asked about it, nearly everyone on the crew had a story of a dislocated joint, usually at the shoulder, but sometimes the hip. The knee is apparently rare to dislocate, but it's still fixable. Another student spoke up. Was that the worst injury you saw? Zavor gave his head a brief side-to-side jerk. Nope. The worst injuries were probably the deaths in the crash that led to that fight, but if you're asking survivable injuries, still no. He took another breath. One of the worst I saw personally was with Turnbull, one of the Marines. The biggest man on the cruiser by a fair margin. Turnbull was also an adrenaline junkie who sought out combat as his drug of choice. I still don't know exactly what they were doing, but a few of the Marines and crew were playing some sort of game in one of the bays. Apparently, someone bumped something he shouldn't have, and one of the shuttles started rotating. The wing caught Turnbull in the leg, bending it at a bizarre angle, and the bone in his upper leg broke in half. It was so bad that the splintered bone tore through his skin and jutted up through his thigh. A collective shudder went through the class as they envisioned the injury. "Did he have to go on convalescence leave?" the student asked, since Zavor had said this was not a lethal injury. Nobody had to ask if the Marine had died, but that still sounded awful. "Amazingly, no," the Red EEG replied. "Humans keep first aid spray on hand pretty much everywhere. It's some sort of aerosolized sealant that keeps blood in and particulates out. Certainly saved my life when that monster tore my back open. If Carver hadn't used some to stop my bleeding, it's unlikely I'd be alive today," he added as an aside. They sprayed over Turnbull's wound, called for a stretcher, and took him to the medical bay. There, the medic dissolved the spray, grabbed the bone, wrenched it back into place. He motioned with his hands to emphasize how this might have happened, clutching at some imaginary protrusion and forcing it down. Another collective wince moved through a little more than half of the crowd, the remainder more in disbelief and unable to accept that such a thing was real. And then he used organic glue to bond the bone together, sealed the wound, and put Turnbull in a cast before calling him an idiot. He was unable to work for about a month, and we all made fun of him. A collective laugh rose up from the crowd. "The question about fire earlier did remind me," Zavor mused, "about Carver. Most human military personnel have at least a few scars, but Carver seems to be more scar tissue than undisturbed skin. He's not much older than the rest of the Marines, so I don't know if he's incredibly fortunate to have survived all of those things, or incredibly unlucky to have gotten into all that trouble in the first place." He took a breath. "I haven't asked about all of his injuries. Just feels rude, as though I'd be treating him like an exhibit. But his voice is raspy from fire damage. The worst thing is, to hear him tell it, he got the injury on shore leave." That statement seemed to have the class on the edge of their seats, so Zavor continued. Jacob Carver was looking forward to some much-needed time off. The war against the Drian Federation was over, and he had lost too many friends to the Avians. While he had re-enlisted, he was thankful that he wouldn't have to fight any more of the damn space bugs. In the aftermath of the war, humanity had earned respect and the chance for friendship among the stars. Already, the higher-ups in the Space Exploration Force were preparing to travel into galactic neutral territory to discuss colonization rights, wanting to go through all the proper channels in order to reinforce that humans were good neighbors when given no cause to be bad ones. The politicking had no real interest to Jacob. He simply wanted to relax with a nice stint in from the SEF. He secured a hotel aboard the Tensei habitat orbiting Saturn. He could spend some much-needed time just decompressing, partying, and indulging in the basest human passions. He got to his hotel, unpacked his luggage, and got changed into a nice outfit. The dark gray jacket went well with his close-shorn brown hair and chocolate eyes, and it didn't make his skin look too pale by comparison. His scars still made themselves known, but he just had to live with them. They make good conversation, starters in some cases, and the adage, how true far, far more often than not, chicks dig scars. He headed downstairs and ordered some drinks at the hotel bar, getting a nice buzz before properly setting out for a night in the town. Outside in the void of space, a minor chunk of the Drian warship spiraled through the blackness. For the most part, salvage efforts had cleaned up the debris for recycling and study, as much as for safety. But in the aftermath of a war, pieces could go missing in the sheer vastness of outer space. In any other situation, this would have no impact. Every station and arcology had a network of rail cannons to destroy approaching stellar debris. This particular debris, however, was a chunk of Starship, including its exterior plating. The automated weapons performed their duty, identifying that the approaching object was not a spacefaring vessel and then opening fire. But rather than breaking the offending debris into so much space dust, the shots sheared it apart. Most of the metal was eventually destroyed, but a shard of the structure support beam hurtled toward the space station like a spear. Alarms blared across Tensei as the fragment, caught in Saturn's gravity, accelerated toward the habitat. Despite the fact that the habitat ceilings displayed an artificial sky, everyone reflexively looked up. The ceiling burst open, the piece of superstructure driving through the station's plating like a tack, and then violent decompression ripped it back out. Air surged out of the habitat section with such force that people and objects were pulled from the ground and funneled toward the breach. In the moments between the impact and the deployment of the bulkheads to cut off the rupture, people and vehicles had been pulled hundreds of feet into the air. Smaller structures were ripped from their foundations, accelerant dripping from torn pipes to meet with active electrical wires and spawn fast-spreading fires. It was as much luck as skill and instinct that saved Carver's life. The sturdy veteran had grabbed for the nearest big object, clinging to a truck and crawling alongside it as the vehicle spiraled through the air. When the vacuum suction cut out, he leapt onto a nearby building rather than riding the truck back down to certain death. The building on which he found himself, however, was in an unhealthy state. He could smell and hear fire, and screams for help rose from within. To stay atop it was a death sentence, as response teams would have far bigger problems to deal with than plucking a single man off the roof of a burning restaurant. Carver would have to brave the flames and get out before they became impenetrable. He threw himself against the rooftop access door several times before it finally gave way. His expletive turned into an aborted yelp as he had to ride the door like a sled down a flight of stairs. There was no way this place was up to code. The door hit the wall at the bottom of the stairs, which meant that he subsequently hit the wall, only barely managing to turn and impact with his back, rather than his head and neck. He staggered out into a forked hallway, wandering into the kitchen from there. He presumed the double doors led to the dining area. Several of the ovens had been damaged by falling debris ripping through the wall, and fire blazed along the side of the kitchen. The screams had mostly died down, likely people filtering out, but he could still hear a single high-pitched shriek coming from the dining area. Giving the flames a wide berth, Carver pulled open the doors to see a fire devouring most of the area. He couldn't assume to know how it spread from the kitchen or whether they had been contemporaneous flames, and honestly, he didn't really care. He could hear a child's voice, a little girl. "Please, please," she screamed. "Anybody! My dad's imprisoned!" Carver lurched forward, choking into the smoke. He shucked his jacket and wrapped it about his face. It wasn't as good as a saturated shirt, but anything would do to filter out the particles. "Where are you? I'm coming over here." The girl shrieked. "By the bar." Carver discovered a blonde-haired little girl, possibly less than 10 years old, with the even, light tan of living under UV arcology lighting. She was bending down to escape the suffocating smoke above, straining against a collapsed ceiling. Some of the top structure had fallen, burying numerous individuals under it, but the child remained concentrated on a set of legs that were still moving. "Stand back. I need to go around here and I don't want to walk on you," he cautioned the girl. Carver analyzed how the ceiling structure had fallen down, the angle at which it lay. "All right, I need you to be strong, girl," he said to her. "When I raise this, grasp your dad's leg and pull with all your strength. You've got to pull him out of here, and don't you dare let up, even if it seems like your bones are breaking, until I say so. Okay?" The girl nodded, brilliant green eyes gleaming with tears. The scarred military guy bent down and pushed, his fingers beneath the frame, his grunt of strain building into a yell of exertion as he lifted the tremendous weight. The kid echoed him, letting out a hoarse, eardrum-rattling scream as she seized her father's ankle and tugged. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the guy moved. He'd been wedged awkwardly, and as his first arm came free, her father demonstrated he was still alive and cognizant by reaching for hold and aiding his daughter to pull him free. Finally, Carver let the load descend, dropping onto his behind, and wheezing for oxygen. "You all right, man?" he questioned the father. The second guy, who had brown hair and blue eyes, wheezed. His eyes widened in worry, and terror compounded the issue. Having encountered similar circumstances previously, Carver promptly identified it. "Lay on your back again. Your windpipe's been smashed. You keep gasping like that, and you shut it entirely. Just concentrate on calm, shallow breaths." Carver would need to conduct a field tracheotomy. Thankfully, the bar would undoubtedly have a metal-stirring straw. He crawled over the rubble and started sifting through the rubbish behind the bar for his reward. Too late, he recognized the hissing roar of a gas pipe bursting. In a panic, Carver reached for a handful of cheap plastic straws instead and attempted to jump away, but the gas was already burning. A torrent of flames, like a dragon's breath, surged over him, soaking his face. He automatically closed his eyes and yelled in agony, letting the flame pour down his throat like a band of voracious wolves clawing and biting at everything. Eyebrows and most of what little hair he had scorched off, Jacob Carver stumbled back to the man and kid, wheezing and shivering. It was his time to wheeze. His voice cords wouldn't operate, too raw and ragged from the scouring fire. He went to his knees and pulled his field knife, pointing with knife and straw, thinking the guy would understand. The father looked, worried, tears of fear beating in the corners of his eyes, but he flashed a thumbs up and offered his daughter a brave smile. Good dude, Carver thought. Carver indicated to himself, took a deep breath, waited for the guy to follow, then making a move he thought the man would perceive as, hold it. The veteran softly poked the knife just above the curvature of the man's sternum, penetrating the skin and causing blood to flow. Then he jammed the straw into the aperture and squeezed it with 2 fingers to carefully keep it in place. He dramatically breathed, suggesting for his impromptu patient to do the same. A spattering of blood burst out the straw. Carver smiled and nodded, with the father taking faint but regular breaths. Carver wrapped one of the man's arms over his shoulders and carried him out. The father's other hand was engaged with grasping his daughter's. Professor Yaren was the first to respond as Zavor completed relaying Carver's account. That's wonderful, she whispered. We hear tales about how people live on a dying planet, but it's simply so far beyond of our sphere of competence. Stories like this, they assist us to better comprehend just what it means that humans are a death planet species. Zavor laughed quietly. It's not the conclusion I made from it, Professor, although by the first time I'd heard it, I'd lived among the humans for many months. The beige-scaled professor tilted her head, silently requesting for the red EEG to continue his train of thought. For humans, life ends more frequently and in more unsettling ways than most of us could conceive. I don't inquire about Earth's predators or cataclysms anymore. Zavor shook his head. It'd be simple to hear all the things we do about humans and assume that they are gloomy people, indifferent of death since it occurs so frequently. The manner that they plot for mass death, we may determine that they believe life to be cheap. But from what I've observed, it is not the case. Humans respect life, in themselves and others. They prepare for mass fatalities because they perceive it as inevitable, and they'd prefer as few as possible perish, rather than lose everyone in a frantic bid to rescue everyone. It was especially poignant since practically everyone knew of a space station or arcology that had been recently modified to comply to human norms. Human stations have many failure points intended to break off and sacrifice a section of the building to preserve the remainder. Humans, Zavor added, would more often than not sacrifice their own life to rescue someone else's, because they'd want someone else to do the same for them. They come up with ingenious techniques to get past obviously deadly injuries and save the important organs since to persevere is human nature. A student raised her hand. How does that reconcile with reports from the war? I realize the Drayans were on the opposite side, so there's going to be some prejudice. But there are accounts of the humans simply killing their way through enemy lines, shooting to kill every time, utilizing terrible weapons for maximum death. How does it match with the folks you depict, who cherish life? Zavor cocked back his head in a sneer. I had the same question in my mind when I witnessed them absolutely annihilate the sect. It was a slaughter, no quarter granted. How could I square that human idiom with the people who'd spent so much time ensuring that Makira and I were healthy? And I believe I figured it out. See, I mentioned earlier that people respect life. In a way, to humans, life is a coin to be spent. In general, they wish to make sure that their lives and those of others aren't wasted frivolously. But then, if someone else wants to attempt terminating your life, then you may guarantee that he wastes his own life as cheaply as possible. From then, the lecture hall slipped into a routine of thinking about human values, with Zavor, for the most part, being baffled. Eventually, the lesson came to a close, and the red EEG was permitted to return to the hospital, away from Tarvin Military Academy. He never did manage to gain Professor Yaren's number. I hope you liked that. Tail. Click straight here to view another video with the same characters. Enjoy next. In a galaxy overflowing with strife and suffering, might humanity's darkest techniques swing the tide of an interplanetary war. Let's get into the narrative. The enormous hall of the Galactic Council was ablaze with holographic displays. Delegates from a dozen star systems debated in 100 languages, their translated voices a cacophony that bounced off the steel walls. Ambassador Litra of the Leon Collective swiveled her multifaceted eyes in annoyance, the chitinous plates of her exoskeleton clicking gently. Order! Order! Her voice, amplified and modulated for maximum impact, broke through the chaos. Our worlds are in flames, and we must act. The quorum representative, a tall insectile monster with serrated mandibles, hissed with enjoyment. Act, little Leon? Is that what you term this sad display? Your worlds burn because you are weak! A wave of fury swept the room. The Leons were a peaceful race, famed for their art and philosophy, not for violence. But they were also one of the founding races of the Council, and their planets were not used to being turned to ash. The quorum will answer for this. Litra, said, her voice wavering slightly. The insectile emissary let out a rasp that served as laughing among his species. Answer to whom? This council? Your armies are dust, your ships scattering. There is no one left to answer to except ourselves. It was true. The rapidity of the quorum attack had been astounding, as scary as it was tactically clever. They had refused to play by the Council's rules of engagement, preemptively assaulting Leon outposts before a formal declaration of war could even be delivered. Litra felt a flood of sadness. They had been too slow, too trusting of the peace their council had fought so hard to achieve. Now they were paying the price in Leon lives. We are not yet defeated, she asserted. The Orions battle with the might of 10. The Valorans still retain their home system, for now. The quorum sneered. But their time will come, as will yours. His attention focused on a portion of the hall that had remained notably silent, a curtained alcove set off from the elevated tiers where the rest of the attendees assembled. Inside, cloaked in carefully nurtured obscurity, was the group from Earth, humans. Perhaps your humans will save you, the quorum teased, his voice dripping with scorn. Humans were the mystery of the Council. They had only interacted via distant lines for the short decades they'd been members, never sending a real representative to the Grand Chamber. The Council knew nothing of the bipedal animals beyond their apparently ordinary technical proficiency and their unsettlingly expansionist impulses inside their own solar system. The humans have always been a wild card, unpredictable. Now, it appeared the Council's entire existence relied on their next action. The hush from the alcove stretched achingly long. Then came a single phrase, conveyed into the room in a low, accented voice, a voice the Council had never heard before. Perhaps. A wave of astonishment rippled across the room. The quorum ambassador halted mid-hiss, his mandibles snapping open and shut in astonishment. The other delegates peered with a combination of terror and eagerness toward the curtained alcove. The human voice continued, slow and deliberate. The quorum ambassador is accurate. This council is weak. Its conventions, its traditions, these are vestiges of an era now eaten by conflict. Litra gasped. Never has a delegation, much less the enigmatic humans, spoken so disrespectfully in this holy place. But there was a peculiar ring of truth about it. Had inaction doomed them? All? The quorum have played by their own rules, the human added. Rules written with the blood of your planets. To answer them, to beat them, we must lay off the old methods. We must become something fresh. A person emerged from the obscurity of the alcove, coming into the intense light of the room. He was tall for a human, garbed in a plain utilitarian jumpsuit, yet there were flecks of gray in his close-cropped hair, and his face was worn, marred with lines that told of a life spent beyond the luxuries of starships and climate-controlled dwellings. My name is General Marcos, he stated, his voice reverberating in the enormous distance. I speak for Earth. He regarded the quorum diplomat with a chillingly serene glare. I assure you, the quorum's time is at an end. A wave of anxious murmuring surged across the room. Marcos's statements were strong, arrogant even. Yet following successive quorum triumphs, there was a tremendous yearning for such defiance surging through the gathering delegates. The quorum ambassador's mandibles clacked violently. Empty? Boasts, little mammal. Your ships are primitive. Your warriors have never tasted battle on this scale. Marcos produced a mirthless grin. Primitive, perhaps, but with a brutality you haven't begun to comprehend. He looked toward the remainder of the council. My proposal is simple. Grant Earth full strategic authority. Place your forces, your shipyards, and the resources of your worlds at our disposal. In return, we'll show you what real war looks like. Litra's multifaceted eyes narrowed. This was lunacy. To entrust such confidence, such power, in the hands of a species they scarcely knew. But hadn't they already failed by relying in the old ways? We cannot, stammered the Valorian representative, a hefty reptile wreathed in flowing robes. This is surrender. It's a gamble, responded Marcos, but a gamble with far better odds than the path you're on now. We've studied the quorum. We know how their minds work, their tactics, their weaknesses. Now it's a question of whether you've got the stomach for what we'll have to do. His eyes ran over the council once again. So, the question is simple. Do you want to live, or do you want to die clinging to your precious traditions? Silence descended over the room, a thick blanket silencing the nervous muttering. Litra felt a knot tighten in her belly. To side with the humans meant to reject everything she knew, to rewrite the fundamental norms of this cosmic civilization. And yet to reject them was to cement the destruction of her planet and many others. The Valorian representative muttered in doubt, his beady eyes flitting between Marcos, the quorum envoy, and the rest of the council. Even the quorum looked temporarily taken aback by the humans' bravado. Finally, a thunderous voice resonated from the Orion delegation. A warrior, the size of a small shuttle, clothed in shining combat armor, moved forward. The Orion clans have grown weary of this council's inaction, he stated, hefting a gigantic energy axe. We will follow this human. We are born for war, and we thirst for the blood of those who have wronged us. An instant chorus of hisses and growls came from the surrounding Orion delegates, a vicious echo to his remark. The Orion fleet, however damaged by the quorum attack, was still a force to be reckoned with. With their assistance, the tide of opinion started to turn. Litra assessed the danger, her heart beating against her segmented thorax. The people were an unknown variable, a desperate bet. But they were possibly the only gamble left. Leah stands with Earth, she proclaimed, her voice soaring over the noise. Let us fight fire with fire. A surge of mixed gasps and shouts greeted Litra's decision. The Valorian delegate, watching the momentum change, grudgingly provided his own tentative approval. One by one, other delegates echoed their agreement, their anxiety eventually drowned out by a frantic urge for action, spurred by Marcos's chillingly confident comments. Finally, all eyes shifted to the quorum diplomat. He erected his insectoid shape, wrath twisting his mandibles in a horrific show. You fools, he yelled, spittle shooting from his jaws. You've signed your own death warrants, the quorum. Swarm will devour you whole. Marcos only nodded, his face chillingly blank. Then the feast begins, he said. With a single resolute move, he turned and vanished back into the curtained nook. The room burst into a whirlwind of activity. Delegates clamored for information, for directions, for anything that might soothe the gnawing anxiety in their hearts. Orders reverberated, urgent signals cut through the noisy cacophony. The immense machinery of the Galactic Council was moving into a mode it had never known, absolute, unrelenting war. And in the middle of it all stood the humans, their unexpected supremacy as jarring as it was essential. The issue weighing on everyone's mind was the same. Had they released a savior or a devil? Within cycles, Marcos unveiled his idea in a presentation that left the council delegates both appalled and perversely captivated. The days of staged fights and official announcements were ended. There would be no quarter offered, No prisoners taken. This is about survival, Marcos stated. His picture beamed across large screens. The Quorum do not negotiate. They do not take pity. They simply eradicate. For them, this is an extermination. His voice reverberating in the enormous distance. I speak for Earth. He regarded the Quorum diplomat with a chillingly serene glare. I assure you, the Quorum's time is at an end. A wave of anxious murmuring surged across the room. Marcos's statements were strong, arrogant even. Yet following successive Quorum triumphs, there was a tremendous yearning for such defiance surging through the gathering delegates. The Quorum ambassadors' mandibles clacked violently. Empty. Boasts, little mammal. Your ships are primitive. Your warriors have never tasted battle on this scale. Marcos produced a mirthless grin. Primitive, perhaps, but with a brutality you haven't begun to comprehend. He looked toward the remainder of the council. My proposal is simple. Grant Earth full strategic authority. Place your forces, your shipyards, and the resources of your worlds at our disposal. In return, we'll show you what real war looks like. Litra's multifaceted eyes narrowed. This was lunacy. To entrust such confidence, such power in the hands of a species, they scarcely knew. But hadn't they already failed by relying in the old ways? We cannot, stammered the Valorian representative, a hefty reptile wreathed in flowing robes. This is surrender. It's a gamble, responded Marcos, but a gamble with far better odds than the path you're on now. We've studied the Quorum. We know how their minds work, their tactics, their weaknesses. Now, it's a question of whether you've got the stomach for what we'll have to do. His eyes ran over the council once again. So the question is simple. Do you want to live, or do you want to die clinging to your precious traditions? Silence descended over the room, a thick blanket silencing the nervous muttering. Lietra felt a knot tighten in her belly. To side with the humans meant to reject everything she knew, to rewrite the fundamental norms of this cosmic civilization. And yet, to reject them was to cement the destruction of her planet and many others. The Valorian representative muttered in doubt, his beady eyes flitting between Marcos, the Quorum envoy, and the rest of the council. Even the Quorum looked temporarily taken aback by the humans' bravado. Finally, a thunderous voice resonated from the Orion delegation. A warrior, the size of a small shuttle, clothed in shining combat armor, moved forward. The Orion clans have grown weary of this council's inaction, he stated, hefting a gigantic energy axe. We will follow this human. We are born for war, and we thirst for the blood of those who have wronged us. An instant chorus of hisses and growls came from the surrounding Orion delegates, a vicious echo to his remark. The Orion fleet, however damaged by the Quorum attack, was still a force to be reckoned with. With their assistance, the tide of opinion started to turn. Litra assessed the danger, her heart beating against her segmented thorax. The people were an unknown variable, a desperate bet. But they were possibly the only gamble left. Leah stands with Earth, she proclaimed, her voice soaring over the noise. Let us fight fire with fire. A surge of mixed gasps and shouts greeted Litra's decision. The Valorian delegate, watching the momentum change, grudgingly provided his own tentative approval. One by one, other delegates echoed their agreement, their anxiety eventually drowned out by a frantic urge for action, spurred by Marcos's chillingly confident comments. Finally, all eyes shifted to the Quorum diplomat. He erected his insectoid shape, wrath twisting his mandibles in a horrific show. You fools! He yelled, spittle shooting from his jaws. You've signed your own death warrants. The Quorum swarm will devour you whole. Marcos only nodded, his face chillingly blank. Then the feast begins, he said. With a single resolute move, he turned and vanished back into the curtained nook. The room burst into a whirlwind of activity. Delegates clamored for information, for directions, for anything that might soothe the gnawing anxiety in their hearts. Orders reverberated, urgent signals cut through the noisy cacophony. The immense machinery of the Galactic Council was moving into a mode it had never known. Absolute, unrelenting war. And in the middle of it all stood the humans, their unexpected supremacy as jarring as it was essential. The issue weighing on everyone's mind was the same. Had they released a savior or a devil? Within cycles, Marcos unveiled his idea in a presentation that left the council delegates both appalled and perverse. And we must respond in kind. Eli captivated. The days of staged fights and official announcements were ended. There would be no quarter offered, no prisoners taken. This is about survival, Marcos stated. His picture beamed across large screens. The Quorum do not negotiate. They do not take pity. They simply eradicate. For them, this is an extermination, and we must respond in kind. Whispers of anxiety swept around the room. This was not the fight any of them had envisioned. But Marcos was unrelenting. Target their brood planets, he said, his tone as icy as deep space. Cut down their supply lines, strike their fleets mid-warp, leaving them adrift in the void. Turn their own technology, their own ruthlessness against them. The humans had spent those opening hours examining every scrap of data available about their new opponent. They found important logistical centers, examined Quorum communication networks, and uncovered the biological flaws contained behind their armored carapaces. Lietra's thoughts raced. This is genocide, the precise thing they'd tried to avoid. And yet the Quorum had forced their hand. Should she, condemn her own people to extinction in the sake of moral righteousness? She glanced at the holographic representations of wrecked Leon cities, the burnt and shattered carcasses of her brethren, and felt the cold steel of determination stiffen inside her. Leah will do what must be done, she replied, her voice a thin thread against the growing clamor of the council room. Marcos's idea was more than simply a tactic. It was a total paradigm change in the way cosmic war was fought. While the council species had battled like refined duelists, the humans were ready to unleash the genuine brutality of warfare against the Quorum. In the weeks that followed, the humans reconfigured starships for speed and stealth, forsaking layers of armor in favor of devastating weaponry. Shipyards around the council territory buzzed day and night, refitting boats for their new mission under watchful human eyes. Leon scientists, their knowledge of art and philosophy repurposed with chilling effectiveness, produced bioweapons, specialized to inflict painful deaths against Quorum physiology. Orion shock soldiers were trained in lightning-fast hit-and-run tactics, appearing from the shadows to assault weak Quorum outposts before melting back into the darkness. The council, toughened under human guidance, became a weapon polished to a razor's edge. Meanwhile, the Quorum resumed their approach, arrogantly unconscious of the black storm brewing against them. Their scout ship communications indicated a rising perplexity as supply lines were unexpectedly cut and apparently impregnable strongholds became quiet overnight. When the human-led counterattack eventually launched, it came not with a flourish of bravado, but with measured, lethal precision. Quorum armadas, caught off surprise, were ripped apart with stunning ease. Brood planets, used to decades of tranquility, were transformed to poisonous clouds. The council races, encouraged by a spate of unexpected triumphs, battled with fresh vigor. The tide had changed, and it had done so with terrible rapidity. News of the battlefield winds spread, like a brush fire over the besieged council territory. The first fear started to dissolve, replaced by a spark of desperate hope. Were the humans, these ruthless strategists from a tiny planet, indeed the ones to restore a decaying galactic society? Yet, behind every triumph story came worrisome echoes of the techniques deployed. The violence unleashed matched, and at times surpassed, that of the Quorum themselves. Some delegates murmured in secret about crimes performed in the interest of survival. Chemical warfare, scorched earth, techniques, the summary execution of detainees. The council chamber, long a place of discussion and diplomacy, became a tense battle room. Holographic projections of battlefields flashed incessantly, and information arrived in a steady flood, accentuated by the dry, emotionless voice of General Marcos. The humans were winning, yet the cost appeared to climb with each passing cycle. Lietra felt herself trapped between the pride of her people's newfound might and the terrible worry about the monster they had helped create. Had they bartered their convictions to preserve their lives? What would they become if the quorum danger was ultimately eradicated? The quorum, trapped in the vice grasp of the humans' cruel plan, struggled to oppose these unexpected techniques. They hurried to defend their brood worlds, drew back their advanced troops to concentrate their defenses. Yet, for the first time in this deadly conflict, the once invincible quorum were the ones responding, always a step behind their newest adversary. As the fight moved in the Council's favor, a new dynamic arose inside its sacred walls. The humans' grasp on this strategic planning was unshakable. Marcos was at the heart of everything. An enigmatic man who neither sought nor accepted acclaim, simply set out brutal measures that appeared to secure success. Litra felt herself both attracted to and repulsed by the human general. There was a single-minded intensity about him, a terrifying clarity of purpose. He took judgments that would have devastated the lives of any other council leader, but outcomes appeared to support his savagery at every step. While the delegates fought and debated, though now with considerably less intensity than before, Marcos just acted. It was as if he grasped that survival in this new period relied less on agreement and more on bold, even monstrous acts committed without hesitation. This transfer of authority, albeit unvoiced, was felt by everybody. The council had become less of a governing body and more of a vehicle for the humans' war machine. The cosmic union, once a symbol of peace, was turning into something darker, more realistic. Even nevertheless, successes continued to come in. The quorum, encountering an unexpected fury from their prey, found themselves forced back, their lines disintegrating. For the first time in aeons, dread resonated in their communications, an unfamiliar idea to this martial people. It appeared that the humans, these newbies to the cosmic arena, had somehow comprehended the essence of the quorum better than the species who'd confronted this adversary for decades. And they were going to utilize that information to the very brink of devastation. The struggle reached its last, deadly culmination on the moons of Zara Prime, the quorum homeworld. The council ships, now a well-oiled engine of devastation under Iki. Marcos's guidance closed in like a noose around the once untouchable center of the quorum empire. The moons, bastions highly armed in protection of the brood queens, formed the theater for a deadly struggle. Orion boarding parties flooded the fortifications, their guttural battle yells booming through the halls of the lunar bases. Leon, scientists, their knowledge of biology twisted into terrible intent, released specialized germs that sent waves of painful death across the quorum ranks. From the bridge of his command ship, Marcos watched the combat develop, his visage a mask of icy resolve. The council had paid dearly for this moment. Entire planets lay in ruin. Warships were destroyed. Now it was time for the reckoning. "Transmit the signal," he told his communications operator. A series of encrypted codes lanced out from the council fleet, slashing across space. Hidden deep in the debris field encircling Zara Prime, a network of recovered quorum probes, reprogrammed by human engineers, reacted. Targeting systems across the quorum defensive network latched onto their most crucial assets, the brood queens, concealed under the surface of the moons. Marcos said a single word: fire. Beams of focused energy tore across space, impacting the moons. The old rock split, tumbling inward. Deep beneath the birthing chambers, priceless quorum queens, the very core of their species' survival, were burnt in blinding bursts of light. It wasn't only a triumph, it was annihilation. And with that, the fight was finished. In the aftermath, an uneasy hush crept over the council chamber. Victorious delegates gathered around, voices hushed in a combination of astonishment and hidden anxiety. The quorum, once an invincible power, were now a shattered remnant, their remaining troops dispersed and fragmented. Litra found herself looking for Marcos amid the throng, but the mysterious general was nowhere to be seen. The alcove for the human delegation remained veiled in darkness. Had the guy who had organized this horrible triumph suddenly vanished? Her own species, like with many of the council races, rejoiced their survival but were terribly upset. She could feel it in their hushed tones and their sad gazes, as if they grieved not only for their dead, but for something else lost along the way, something fundamental to the spirit of their once peaceful relationship. As the roar of joy rose, a discordant note hit. A single loud voice erupted from the Orion delegation, a sound Litra knew. It was the clan head who had originally rallied behind Marcos's merciless tactics. "The council is weak," he yelled, displaying his bloodied energy axe. "The humans have shown us true strength, true power." A surge of approval swept through the Orion ranks, mingling with worry from other delegations. It was a terrifying echo of the Quorum ambassador's comments expressed not so long ago in this exact room. And the Orion continued, "Power should be its own reward." He fixed his gaze on the curtained alcove. "The humans have rescued us. Now is the moment for them to lead us." A collective gasp filled the air. The Orion's words were like a firebrand, thrown amongst kindling. For cycles, an unspoken fear had lurked beneath the surface. What would happen when this war, fought under the banner of survival, was finally over? Who would truly hold the power? Other Orion took up the rallying cry, voices booming with a thirst for dominance that had been dormant for far too long. The Valorian, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, began murmuring amongst themselves. Even amongst the Leons, Litra saw a flicker of ambition in some, tempered by a far deeper horror. Had they merely traded one monstrous threat for another? Suddenly, the curtains of the alcove were thrust aside. Marco stood framed in the opening, but it wasn't the same man who had stood there weeks ago. The weathered face was now etched with a deep exhaustion, and there was something haunted in those cold eyes. "No," he said, his voice, normally so, strong, echoing feebly across the vastness of the chamber. "The humans will not lead you." A flash of sadness ran through the Orion delegation, immediately replaced by seething rage. "Coward!" the clan leader spat. "You've tasted power. You will not deny it." He hefted his weapon threateningly. Marcos met his gaze, sadness now mixing with the weariness in his eyes. "We've tasted blood, Orion. Power built on the bones of billions is no power at all. It is a curse." He stopped, his voice almost a whisper. "And we bear that burden for all of you now." With that, he turned his back on the chamber, disappearing once more into the shadows of the alcove. The humans had left the stage, but the play was far from over. The Galactic Council, irrevocably transformed, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding, not just their worlds, but their very moral compass. In the years that followed, the Galactic Council embarked on a path of uneasy reconstruction. The shattered Quorum imposed little threat. Their once mighty empire was now reduced to bickering remnants struggling for survival. But beneath the veneer of victory, a deep rift ran through the alliance. The Orion, emboldened by their military prowess, openly challenged the Council's traditional structure. They pushed for expansion, for the subjugation of lesser races, for a new age of galactic dominance with themselves at its forefront. The Valorian, scarred by war, preached caution and a return to the old traditions, but their voices seemed weak. Litra, now an elder stateswoman, devoted her life to ensuring the Galactic Council never strayed far from the lessons learned in the War of Annihilation. The specter of Marcos and his ruthless strategies was never forgotten. Holographic recordings of his declarations remained locked in the deepest archives of the Council, a perpetual cautionary tale. There would always be those who whispered of the necessity of his tactics, who saw unchecked power as the surest path to security. But there were more who spoke of the survivors from Earth, of the quiet resolve of the reformed Quorum, and of Litra, whose multifaceted eyes had seen both the abyss of war and the tenuous hope of something better. And so, the Council endured a patchwork of fractured alliances constantly tested and mended. For in a vast galaxy filled with the echoes of conflict, true peace was an unachievable ideal. The best they could hope for was the courage to navigate between war and ruin, to forever strive for the day when the words, "When humans joined the war, it was over in hours," became a dark chapter of history and nothing anymore. I hope you enjoy this tale. I hope you subscribe this channel for more these type of interesting stories.